Broadcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, it's Patrick Verino here. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. I was recently working with an individual who, in our work, he had called me the behaviors guy. And as I think about that, a lot of the work that I do is around behaviors. I am sort of the behavior guy. And this episode is really all about that. It's about behaviors. There seems to be so much division right now in this country on so many different issues, whether it's race or COVID, wearing masks, don't wearing masks, do you like the police, don't you like the police, Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, whatever it is. In the work that I do around behaviors, one of the things that really has resonated with me through this whole thing is this idea of what's called the Pygmalion effect. I use this work a lot in terms of leadership development that I do, whether it's with teams or individuals or organizations. The power that Pygmalion has, and some aren't going to like to hear this, but we are actually creating the environments that we say we don't want to live in by our expectations. And I'm going to walk through how that happens on this. And I'm going to reference one study that I use quite often. The title of it is Leadership and Expectations, Pygmalion Effects, and Other Self-Fulfilling Prophecies in Organizations. It was published by an individual, a researcher named Dov Eden, and it was in Leadership Quarterly in 1992. As I said, it's an article that I use quite often in the work that I do. It's a rather lengthy study or paper. It's about 38 pages, but there is so much in here that talks about many different things, from Pygmalion effect to Golem effect, which is the opposite of Pygmalion, to self-fulfilling prophecies and transformational leadership, or the leader-member exchange, really how all of these come into play. So what I thought I'd do on this is really talk about what is Pygmalion, and then relate it back to really the environment that we're in, because even though this paper that I'm referencing talks about self-fulfilling prophecy in organizations, we really can look at this as though it's self-fulfilling prophecies in societies where we're living right now. And I'm going to make the case that this happens in our societies just like it does in organizations. First, I want to talk about pre-Pygmalion. And this was actually work that was done around what's called Theory X and Theory Y. And it was introduced in 1960 by a researcher named Douglas McGregor. And I'm going to read something here around Theory X and Theory Y just to give you an idea of what the concept is about. So McGregor described the circular self-fulfilling prophecy by which managers' assumptions, or our expectations, determine how they treat their subordinates, which in turn affects how the subordinates respond. So a manager acting on Theory X assumptions mistrusts workers, refrains from delegating authority to them, and supervises them closely. This leads to fulfillment of the manager's prophecy, as workers so treated react by exerting less effort on the job. In contrast, belief in Theory Y leads to a manager who trusts their people and seek ways of achieving greater integration between individual and organizational goals. McGregor held that workers live up to the trust placed in them and respond responsibly to the challenge by redoubling their efforts and redoubling their commitment and motivation. So again, we can see when we talk about Theory X and Theory Y, how does that relate to how we treat other people? Well, if we think about, let's use the political parties, for example, that if I'm a conservative, how I might look towards somebody that's more liberal, I expect them to act a certain way. I treat them a certain way based on my own beliefs and approaches. And by doing that, I really reinforce those behaviors that I probably would say I don't like in that other individual. It creates what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't trust you, and I'm going to treat you in a way that says I don't trust you, or vice versa, liberal toward conservative. It doesn't matter. Whatever the issue is, anybody that we're having an issue with, our beliefs in who we think that person is plays itself out here. And I think things have gotten so much worse today because of our isolation that we are in front of each other far less. And also when we are, we're masked up, oftentimes not able to see who the other person really is. It's almost like we're hiding behind a mask, literally. And I do believe that that impacts our level of civility toward each other. I will often do in some of the workshops a scale, what I call a civility scale. And I will start out with texting or email and go all the way to in person. And what I do is I say that when we're texting or emailing somebody, that's where our level of civility is probably at its lowest because there's such a buffer there. I don't really have interaction with them. Whereas if I'm in person with them, even if I'm on the phone with them, it's a scale that I'm less abrasive potentially on the phone than I am just in a text or in an email. And I'm even less so if it's in person. And let's face it, there are things that we would say or do on a text or an email that if we were face-to-face with a person, we probably wouldn't do that. And one of the examples that I will often use in this is if we think about road rage, that we think of somebody cutting into a line of traffic. Well, imagine you were in the grocery store and I'm waiting and there's a little bit of room between me and the cart in front of me and somebody just sort of slides their cart right in. That would have a different approach, right? Nobody's really going to be tolerant of that in a grocery store, or very few are. But in an automobile, we seem to have far more ability to be able to do that. All right, so out of the grocery store and back to Pygmalion. The first Pygmalion study was done by Lenore Jacobson and Robert Rosenthal. And what they did, this was in 1963, they looked at kids in grade school and they had them all take an IQ test. But then what they did was they arbitrarily labeled some of these kids as academic bloomers. Had nothing to do with their actual scores, but they put them down as academic bloomers and then let their instructors know which kids were the academic bloomers. What they found was at the end of the school year, or the follow-up from this study, that those kids that were rated as or ranked as the academic bloomers did better than the other kids in the control group. And it had nothing to do with their actual IQ scores. So what they then did, the most famous study was done in 1968, which was called Pygmalion in the Classroom. Very similar type of setting, but what they did was they had students and their instructors, and the instructors were told, here are your kids that are high potential, these kids are average potential, and these kids are unknown. And at the end of the semester, when these kids were graded, what they found was that those kids that were the high potential, again, had nothing to do with their actual potential, those kids did the best. The average kids sort of did average, and those that were unknown sort of were scattered somewhere in between there. But what it started to do was really uncover how our treatment toward others of what we expect of them creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. So here we talk about it in a school setting. Well, another researcher then went on, a gentleman named Sterling Livingston, and he said, well, let's take a look at this from a standpoint of management. What happens there? And we already have some idea of what happens, because when we can go back and think of Douglas McGregor's work in regards to Theory X and Theory Y, we can sort of see where this goes. But Livingston did the same thing with managers and employees, and again, saw these same results. Well, to me, it gets even more interesting when we look. The author of this study was involved in some research as well with the Israel Defense Forces. So here they are looking at Pygmalion as it relates to the armed services. And in this, there were 100 individuals that were involved in a study, officers going through this training course, which was going to be a written course at the end. There were 4 instructors, and what the instructors were told was, here are the assessments that have been done for each of your cadets that are going to be in your class. We want you to memorize these so you know who you have in your class. So it was based on command potential. And it was high potential, potential unknown, or average potential. Again, written exam, what they found was at the end of this course that those that were considered high potential scored the best, statistically significant on this written exam, yet it had nothing to do with their actual potential. It gets more interesting in that study in that what they then did was they said, okay, let's take a look on a couple different areas in terms of these individuals that went through this boot camp, right? So when we look performance, we can again see those designed as high in, or those that were designated as high in command potential, significantly outperformed their classmates in all the subjects that were rated. And when we looked at attitudes, each of the trainees filled out a questionnaire that included items asking whether they would recommend the course to a friend, if they desired to go on to the next course, as well as their overall satisfaction. And on all of those, the ones that were considered high expectation trainees, they rated all of those more favorably. Now, lastly, what they then did was they looked and said, okay, let's ask about leadership. What they found was that the trainees that were considered high potential rated their instructors' leadership as significantly higher. Now, why is this? It would seem through each of those that when they're asked, those that were considered high potential probably got more attention, more expectations were put on them of positive things that they could do, all based on what they were told they should expect from this individual. They lived up to that. Again, self-fulfilling prophecy. I go back to our society right now. How does this play into it? If you hear somebody's a Trump supporter, what do? Automatically, you start to have a vision of who this person is, and you treat them as such. And I would argue you start this process of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and vice versa. If you are a Trump supporter and you're looking at somebody that is a Democrat or you think of them as more liberal, right, you are automatically thinking of them as a certain individual and treating them such when you have interactions with them. This is detrimental to our ability to be open to looking at, just because somebody has a different perspective on things, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're a bad person. The bottom line of this is to say that if we want to see better out of people, we should expect more, and we should let them know that. And I'll give you an example of that in work that I do with organizations where we'll talk about, the problem employee. Well, I believe that managers are part of the problem for the problem employee, because basically we create this self-fulfilling prophecy in them. And one way to get out of that is to place different expectations on that individual. And what I mean by that is to let this person know you're better than this. This is not who you are. I don't believe that you are an uncaring person. We may have differences, but I don't believe that you mean to be mean-spirited on this, that you disrespect other people the way I've been told that your group does. You can see how important that is. I'm telling somebody that, just because we have differences, I don't think that this person necessarily is uncaring or they're selfish or whatever it might be. And when we have interactions with people, if we go in with the expectation of the positive, then we will tend to look for those things as opposed to want to reinforce why this person is such a bad person. We're creating part of that. When we go on, we look at what's called the Golem effect. And the Golem effect is really the opposite of Pygmalion. It says that if I don't expect much of you, then you won't disappoint either. And that's really where we spend the majority of our time, it seems today, is we don't expect much of somebody else. And really, we're not disappointed because we don't get much out of other people when we don't expect much. That self-fulfilling prophecy is coming into play again. They're living up to that negative bias that we believe this person is. My wife and I have friends that are both liberal and conservative. Yet when we're together, I look and we both can say, as we sit, I would say somewhere in the middle on this, and we share, I would say, beliefs that straddle both sides of this, that they are all close to us. for different reasons, but they're all good people and they care about other people. Yet if you didn't know these individuals and we just put labels out there, you might not have that same interpretation or understanding or appreciation for who these people are. Again, I go back to isolation. The less we are able to interact with other people, we live off of labels. And those labels then create this self-fulfilling prophecy. So one of the last pieces that I will talk about is what's called the leader-member exchange. And again, this is extremely powerful, I think, in the world that we're in right now. And this was actually, one of the researchers on this was a gentleman named George Grain. The leader-member exchange really talks about what's called an in-group and an out-group. And when you are part of the in-group, right, your performance tends to be better. But if I feel like I've been pushed outside of the group, a couple different things can happen. One, I could disengage. The other is that I could engage in ways that are damaging to society, the organization, the team as a whole, because I feel like I've been pushed outside of this group. And again, I think we see this on such a heightened level today of the in-group versus the out-group. When we push people outside and we don't find ways to include them, then we are exacerbating this leader-member exchange, this in-group and out-group mentality. In much of the work that I do around the Cables leadership system that I've developed, one of the behaviors in Cables is around belongingness. And belongingness, there's so much research around the impact that this has. We are pack animals. We need each other, and we're looking for connections. And we could go to a prison that maybe somebody from a gang, and we talk to them. And there are many interviews that you can pull up that talk about, or where you'll hear gang members talk about how growing up, they were always ostracized. They were always the troubled person. They were always looked at as different. So what did they do? They found a group that accepted them. They became part of an in-group. Unfortunately, it was a violent in-group, but it still was somebody that they were part of an in-group. They were part of somebody, a group that accepted who they were. And again, you look at the violence that's around us. We have in-groups and out-groups. We have done very little to really try and say, how do we create inclusion for everybody here, regardless of our differences? How can we start finding a place that we can agree and then work from there to build off of that? And we can. We clearly can, and we need to, because when we come right down to it, there are many things that we share as core beliefs or values that we all want. We're just approaching them in different ways. And either Golem is preventing us from looking at other people that they want the same things, or we're not leveraging Pygmalion enough to be able to create the environments that we want. And that's really what this is about. So rather than talk about strategies from a standpoint of what we would call a Pygmalion leader, that's somebody that basically tries to create an environment of expectation of others. We are looking at this from a standpoint of creating Pygmalion citizens, Pygmalion individuals, where rather than looking for the negative things in other people, is really, let's raise our standards for everybody here in terms of how we're going to treat each other. There's a real ownership that we can have here. And when we do that, when we can raise that expectation for us as individuals and as human beings and as sharing really probably many core desires, we will find that we're able to overcome much of the divisiveness. And this isn't to say utopia or, right, that there's this Pollyanna approach here. But certainly it's to say that we can do it without violence and disruptive behaviors in a way that really will just continue to erode our society. To me, I look at the situations that we're in right now. These are dress rehearsals. We will face bigger challenges down the road, and I think our ability to navigate these successfully today will do far more for how we will set ourselves up to be able to deal with bigger things that are coming. I realize this has been a long rant, but I think it is such a powerful and important topic. And I think if you haven't had an opportunity to really dig into Pygmalion and Golem and self-fulfilling prophecies and how we play into this, our behaviors, how we create this environment that we say we don't want to see, we have the ability to create the environment we do want to see. But it's going to require us to have a different set of expectations on how we show up toward other people. And I hope you'll take that challenge. Peace.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.